Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrent series on the history and geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's lecture is part one of opium. I'll begin with what we might call the opium paradox. Opium is an extraordinarily useful and extremely dangerous substance, useful medically and dangerous socially, psychologically, and medically as well. The opium poppy latex, well, I should go back to the earlier slide. You can see how opium is made by taking the seed pod of the opium poppy and carefully cutting it or scoring it with a sharp implement, and the latex oozes out, and that is collected and then processed to make opium. And in that latex, there are a number of very medically useful alkaloids. Morphine is a very powerful analgesic or pain reliever. It is also classified as a depressant. Codeine is also a depressant. It's an analgesic as well. And more importantly, I suppose it's used as a cough suppressant, anti-diarrheal. Morphine is anti-diarrheal as well. It can cause severe constipation, I should say. Thebaine is quite different. It's a stimulant, and in large enough quantities, it can cause convulsions. So here we have an interesting combination of substances. The two more important ones are depressants, but then we have one that's a stimulant. And then there are other kinds of alkaloids present. One useful as an antispasmodic or to prevent convulsions. Interesting. We got that same duality again. And to induce vomiting, which actually has medical uses, and another is an important as a cough suppressant, as is codeine. Opium versus opium. Interesting thing about thebaine, which is this unusual or atypical alkaloid in the sense that it's within opium, in the sense that it's a stimulant, whereas the others are depressants, and it can be chemically converted to naloxone and other substances that are used to prevent overdose deaths. So naloxone is what's known as an opioid antagonist. It reverses the effect of opiates and opioids, which are synthetic analogs. And it rapidly binds to receptors in the brain. The brain has certain structures in which opiates and opioids fit into and then are activated. But with this substance will bind to those receptors but does not activate them, so it doesn't have the effects. And naltrexone evidently can reduce euphoria and cravings for both opiates and alcohol, but can also reduce the body's ability to manage pain. So there's very often trade-offs in these sorts of things. I'm not going to go into the biochemistry at all, but I just do want to show you how complicated it is. You have these very, very geometrically complicated receptors in the brain and often other parts of the bodies, and then certain chemicals, certain substances will then fit into them and activate them. And we'll talk later on about cannabinoid receptors in the brain, but that's true for many drugs. So, and I would note that the thebaine is found in the opium poppy, but it's found in much greater quantities in what is known as the Persian poppy or great scarlet poppy, which is now cultivated to make these semi-synthetic opioids, where you take the thebaine and then change the chemistry so that it becomes one of these substances used to prevent overdose or cravings for opium as well. Historically, opium was one of the few plants domesticated in Europe. So agriculture came to Europe at what is known as the Neolithic Revolution, which originated in the Middle East or Near East, the Fertile Crescent, and then farmers started spreading into Greece, up the Danube Valley, also across the Mediterranean, bringing what is sometimes called the Neolithic package with them of cultivation of wheat and barley, a variety of other foods, farm animals as well. But a few crops were actually domesticated in Europe. Maybe oats and rye might be good examples. But opium, all the evidence is that it was domesticated in Europe. It was probably domesticated originally for seeds. Opium seeds are nutritious, actually quite tasty. Maybe the use of opium as a drug was known from the beginning. It's impossible to say. But we do know that it was domesticated. Wild plants do not grow. There's no wild progenitor. Opium plants can go feral and spread, but there's never been any discovery of a direct progenitor plant. But anyway, it was being cultivated in the Mediterranean by 5,500 BCE and only a couple hundred years later in France. So it spread pretty quickly. Poppy seeds are still consumed fairly widely today, mostly in Eastern Europe and parts of India. I have here in the illustrations a poppy seed cake and a poppy seed nut roll, a dessert from India as well. You can see poppy seed production is concentrated in some parts of Eastern Europe. We have Czech Republic and Hungary. Czech Republic is both of them are more Central Europe. So perhaps I should say Central Europe rather than Eastern Europe. But interestingly, Spain and France produce quite a bit, and Turkey is at the leading position. When was opium first used as a drug? Well, as far as direct evidence goes, we know that at least by the 14th century BCE, in the Bronze Age, sort of the late Bronze Age, opium was definitely used as a drug because archaeologists have discovered in Israel pottery with residue of opium. Also was in pottery shaped like inverted opium flowers, and it was also found at a burial site, which is indication maybe it was used as an end-of-life ritual, or perhaps just simply to ease the pain and reduce the suffering of a dying person. Some scholars think it was used much earlier. Ancient Sumerians, so Sumeria and southern Mesopotamia or Iraq is usually considered the world's first civilization insofar as the first to develop urbanization, highly integrated states, literacy, and so on. So that's about 5,000 years ago. And the Sumerians did talk about a plant that can be translated as joy plant. That's usually associated with the opium poppy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were using it as a drug. Maybe they just got a lot of joy out of poppy seeds. Who knows? There's certainly a lot of speculation, and it's hard to get firm evidence. But by 1600 BCE, a couple hundred years before that first finding of actual opium residue, we get ceramics that may not have the residue on it, but are just filled with opium symbolism. So we have from Crete, island now part of Greece. It was not a Greek-speaking island at the time, what is called Minoan civilization, which was a very highly developed mercantile civilization that developed sort of more in the mid-Bronze Age, reaching a high point from about 1600 to 1400 BCE. And there's a fairly well-known statue known as the Poppy Goddess because the statue has these removable poppy capsules in her head, if you will. And this is just one of many examples. Ancient Egypt, a little bit later, though, we find the final pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, Torset, a female pharaoh, with these opium her opium earrings have been discovered, so linked to her at any rate. Now, maybe people were making opium earrings, or we can see here an opium brooch pin from Bronze Age Mycenaean Greece, further north from Crete. Maybe people were making these simply because they were so interested in poppy seeds, but I rather doubt it. I think opium by this time was being used as a medicine and a drug for a variety of other purposes. It was certainly ritually significant in classical Greece, and again we have some more archaeological findings of opium-shaped vessels and the like. But we also know from textual sources that the goddess Demeter was said to have eaten opium after the abduction of her daughter Persephone by Hades. Very, very important Greek myth. We'll actually come to Demeter and Persephone again when we talk about psychedelic drugs, because many scholars think that the Eleusinian mysteries, which were designed to sort of recount this abduction, that people were taking a drink laced with ergot, a kind of fungus that has lysergic acid very close to what LSD is. A little bit different, but definitely psychedelic. But the ancient Greeks associated opium with the god of sleep, Hypnos, and the god of night, Nyx, which is not surprising. Opium is a depressant. Taking it results in relaxation, sort of numbness, reduction of anxiety, and then followed by a sleep with very, very vivid dreams is one thing that's notable about the opium experience. It was also associated with the goddess Aphrodite, usually referred to as the goddess of love, maybe more appropriate to say the goddess of sex, or perhaps sex and love, but certainly a goddess associated with pleasure and fertility, which would indicate perhaps opium being used in a recreational manner, although the Greeks certainly did not perceive of it as a recreational drug. I have a slide on that a bit later on. There are a lot of speculations of different scholars about different words the ancient Greeks used referring to drugs. So in Homer and some other sources, nepenthe is recounted as a drug of forgetfulness, and it literally means anti-sorrow. Supposedly was used for soldiers for consolation after battle deaths. Nobody knows what it was. Was it opium? Was it mythical? It's impossible to say. I do find it interesting that the term is being used for branding wine and cannabis extracts and other sorts of things these days. So in Homer's Odyssey, Book 4, just to quote it, then Helen, daughter of Zeus, took other counsel. Straightway she cast into the wine that they were all drinking nepenthe to quiet all pain and strife and bring forgetfulness to every ill. Does sound a bit like what opium would do. And it was mixed with wine at the time. As far as ancient medical texts, it appears in classical Greek medical works, first by Theophrastus. Theophrastus was a student of Aristotle, and when Aristotle was forced into exile, Theophrastus took over the Lyceum Aristotle School and ran it for many years, so he's usually considered the main successor to Aristotle. He was also noted as the father of botany because he wrote extensively on it. Celsus, a Greek physician. Interesting, I talked in the introductory lecture about Paracelsus, a Renaissance era physician who's famous for saying that a poison is made by the dose, and really emphasizing the importance of dose. What could be a medicine at one dose level becomes a deadly poison at another. Dioscorides, who is usually considered the father of pharmacology. He wrote a very important book, Materia Medica, medical plants. Well, not just plants, mostly plants, but also other substances, which was a very important text all the way through into the early modern period in Europe. And anyway, Dioscorides talked about mixing wine and mandrake. We'll talk about mandrake. That's a very potent hallucinogenic and deliriant drug, but use it before amputations. Well, actually, that was very good advice because the combination is very useful for avoiding the agony that one would get with amputations, and as a sleep aid, as an analgesic. And then Galen, who was the most important medical writer in the classical world, was in the Roman Empire, but he was Greek and wrote in Greek. He started out as a doctor of treating gladiators, so he had probably a lot of experience with opium for pain suppression. And he also administered opium to the emperor Marcus Aurelius, the most philosophical of all Roman emperors, who also had some severe health problems. But Galen warned of the problems with abuse, so it was already known in ancient time that opium was very powerful but very, very dangerous. So in ancient Greece, opium was used medically, especially for pain relief. psychologically for grief, spiritually probably in rituals and mysteries, more uncertainty here. It was mixed with hemlock for suicide. Hemlock, famous poison that Socrates was forced to drink when he was put to death. And I'd say there's little, if any, evidence of casual use or addiction, but certainly there was a knowledge of its problematic nature with addiction, but it wasn't anything that Greek writers were writing about. So this leads to an interesting question: is sort of what we might call, or what we do call, recreational drug use. Is it largely a modern phenomenon, or perhaps people were using drugs in what we would today consider a recreational manner back in ancient times, but there just wasn't a recognition that it was done this way. People might say, well, he's taking opium for grief and taking too much, and it's become a problem. So anyway, there's definitional issues here to consider as well. Now, there were a lot of difficulties in pre-modern times in taking opium. It was expensive. There's a lot of labor involved in scoring those poppies and gathering that little bit of latex and processing it. So it was certainly in those days quite expensive. It was eaten or applied in poultices. Poultices would be quite useful for analgesic properties for a wound, for example. But generally, it was eaten, sometimes often mixed with wine. But it's very bitter, difficult to get down, cause gastrointestinal side effects. And also there's quite a bit of evidence that when opium is eaten, it's not quite as euphoric as when it is smoked, although we'll see later on, opium is really never smoked. It doesn't burn and create smoke, but it can be vaporized, which looks a lot like smoking. It is called smoking, but it's a different process. So anyway, opium was from Europe and the Mediterranean world, and it probably spread eastward to Persia and even to India with the armies of Alexander. So Alexander, I like this map. It has Alexander, quote, the Great, because he was a great conqueror, but wasn't great at anything else. He was quite brutal and an inept administrator, and died quite young, was a very heavy drinker himself. So I hesitate to call him Alexander the Great, although he certainly was a great general. That's undeniable. And his conquest went all the way to India. Empire broke up, but Greeks continued to rule in what is now Afghanistan and even down into Pakistan, then part of India culturally, for a couple hundred years. So there was a lot of back and forth. A lot of Greek artistic motifs moved into the Indian world. Indian philosophical beliefs probably moved in the opposite direction. So at any rate, in the medieval Islamic world, opium was very important as a medical drug. And I have here an image of Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, who was a Central Asian or Persian scholar, wrote in Arabic around the year 1000. But Avicenna was the most important medical writer in not just in the Muslim world, but in Europe as well, along with Galen. They were sort of the two leading medical writers all the way up into the early modern period. So you don't want to discount Avicenna. Anyway, to quote from this article from The Lancet, he clearly described the analgesic activity of opium, pain relief in other words, and explained that it can be used to treat any type of pain. He recommended prescribing it only in refractory chronic headaches, joint pain, toothaches, earaches, and other conditions, and even prescribed different ways of delivering it: orally, topically, rectally, and intranasally. So despite the importance of Galen and Avicenna, opium really diminished in medieval Europe as a medicine, but it was used. And we have good evidence of this from Hildegard of Bingen. And Hildegard is someone who I think deserves much more attention, a saint of the Roman Catholic Church, most famous probably for her mysticism, but she was a noted musician, composer of music, a philosopher, but also a medical writer and a medical practitioner, and a grower in her convent of medical plants. And so she grew poppies. She also warned about their dangers. She knew that they had great benefits, but could cause problems with overuse, addiction, and so on, and cautioned that they should only be used in extreme cases. We really get our first solid evidence of what we would today consider recreational use of opium. And I hesitate to use that word because I don't think recreational is the right term, but maybe just non-medical use. From the Mughal Empire of India in the early modern period. So Mughal Empire was a Muslim empire ruling over a mostly Hindu population. It was at its strongest in the 17th century or 1600s. And Emperor Jahangir was in power when 1605 to 1627, when the Mughal Empire was extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, ruled northern India, most of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and into central India. But it's well known that Jahangir was a drunkard when a young adult. When his father, the great Akbar the Great, and he does deserve that designation, the Great, when Akbar the Great was alive, Jahangir spent his days with moonshine, with alcohol. But slowly over a few years, opium replaced alcohol. Well, it didn't exactly replace it, because you can see in the next line, that should be his. His regular potion was 2.5 grams of opium mixed with 6 cups of wine. So you may wonder, how did the Mughal Empire continue to function, and function very successfully, when its ruler was an alcoholic and opium addict? And the answer was, it was his wife, Nur Jahan, who ruled while Jahangir dreamed. And that's pretty well established these days. There are a number of books on the subject. It has been suggested that opium use contributed to the decline of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire had been very strong and continued to be strong under Emperor Aurangzeb, who had been the grandson of Jahangir. But when Aurangzeb died in 1707, the empire, well, didn't exactly collapse, but it got reduced to a small remnant of its previous size and power quite quickly. It was a semi-collapse. And so one view is that there was just too much opium use among the elite. An alternative theory is that Aurangzeb tried to curb or prohibit opium use, contradicting precedents set by early emperors, and that resulted in a lot of dissatisfaction among the elite. Evidently, more than a few had developed an opium habit. I think both of these theses are greatly exaggerated, because we know pretty well what happened with the Mughal emperor after the death of Aurangzeb. One thing was Aurangzeb tried to conquer too much. You can see he did conquer a lot. He conquered most of southern India, but it was not at all easy. Well, it was extraordinarily expensive, difficult, and then it resulted in tremendous uprisings and rebellions, and was devastating to the treasury. It was superficially successful, but in deep terms not successful at all. Also, Aurangzeb was quite a strict Muslim, some would even say a fundamentalist, and he's, unlike his predecessors, was engaged in activities of restricting Hindu practice. This, I should say, is a subject of debate. Some scholars will point out to the fact that even under Aurangzeb, a lot of leading officials of the empire were actually Hindu rather than Muslim. But unlike his great-grandfather, grandfather and father, Aurangzeb was very much a hardcore believer, and that did result in a lot of dissatisfaction with the Hindu majority. Plus, one other thing is, some would say that Aurangzeb's biggest problem was he lived too long. The Mughal Empire had a system in which the sons of the emperor went out and became powerful governors of provinces, but then after the emperor died, they were supposed to fight it out among themselves to see who was the best. But by the time Aurangzeb died, his sons were old, his grandsons were getting involved, and the Secession War was quite destructive. Anyway, at the same time as the Mughal Empire further west, you had the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the Balkan Peninsula of Europe, centered in Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was still officially called. So the Ottoman Empire was one of the superpowers of the time, as was the Mughal Empire. Istanbul was one of the largest cities of the world in the early modern period. And alcohol was certainly consumed in both, but it was disparaged in the Ottoman Empire and often officially forbidden because of the religious strictures of Islam, where alcohol is not to be allowed. Now, is opium to be allowed? Well, no, according to the strictest interpretation of Sharia or Islamic law, but the Quran was not, and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad were not nearly, they were very clear about alcohol, at least about wine. Although some would say it's really only date wine. But anyway, I don't want to get into those issues so much. But yeah, alcohol was disparaged. It was certainly consumed, but it was something that the state was quite opposed to. Cannabis was also widely consumed. We'll talk about that. But it was disparaged by Ottoman elites anyway. It was associated with Sufi mystics who were not concerned with worldly issues in general, so were relatively poor, although Sufi brotherhoods could be very powerful in their own right. Also associated with students. Anyway, the elites of the Ottoman Empire, many of them tended to prefer opium as a drug above alcohol or cannabis. The prevalence of opium use as a elite recreational drug, if you will, in the Ottoman Empire was known in Europe. There was a lot of animosity between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but a lot of connections and trade as well. And there were certainly travelers, ambassadors from Europe into the Ottoman Empire. And anyway, as this article on opium experimentation and alterity in France goes into the issue of, I'll quote it here, the Renaissance trope of the Turk drunk on opium entered as a theme of 17th century medical literature. So a disparaging trope. There was a lot of animosity towards Ottoman Turks, and they were often, the elites anyway, denounced as opium addicts. Also note that the household physician to the Duke of Orleans remarked in 1689 that medical writers earlier in the century had viewed opium along with hellebore and mercury as, quote, monsters and wild beasts they did not know how to tame. In other words, they knew about the addiction problems. Hellebore and mercury are toxins. It can be sometimes effective as medicines, but they're extremely dangerous and not to be taken lightly. In the 17th century, itinerant merchants of opium-containing remedies started traveling in Europe, selling their drugs in towns and seasonal affairs. In France, these traveling healers were known as operators or charlatans, a term that came into use. So, in other words, opium use as medicinally, was there all along, but was kind of under the wraps, but recreationally being established among the Ottoman elite, it starts to spread into Europe. And in the year 1700, an important book called The Mysteries of Opium, revealed by one John Jones, became an important work. To quote here from this article in Trends in Pharmacological Sciences, in his 1700 treatise, Jones provided a fairly accurate description of the consequences of both acute and chronic opium use. At the time he was writing, opium was usually taken in Europe as laudanum, a generic term for a diverse array of preparations involving crude opium mixed with wine and other ingredients to disguise its bitter taste. So in these sort of traveling medicine shows, if you will, that were going around Europe in the 17th century, preparations with alcohol and opium were commonly used and sold. And laudanum goes on to have a very important career subsequently. By the late 18th century, 1700s, especially in the UK, laudanum was very widely consumed. It was considered to be a benign alternative to arsenic and mercury, which are poisonous substances that can indeed have some medical use. For example, mercury was used very extensively with syphilis and I believe other venereal diseases as well. There was a line from the time that one night with Venus would result in a lifetime with Mercury. In other words, one night with generally with a prostitute who was infected with syphilis, then would result in a lifetime of sickness and treatment with mercury, which sometimes could be worse than the disease itself. Anyway, laudanum was very effective for diarrhea. Opium constipates a person. Cholera and dysentery were spreading, especially in the early 1800s. And opium doesn't treat cholera, but people often die from dehydration from diseases like that. So by preventing that diarrhea, it could have been successful. Cough suppressant for bronchitis and tuberculosis. Yes, it's an effective cough suppressant. Used for insomnia, rheumatism, menstrual cramps. Well, mostly for symptoms, certainly not for causes. Laudanum, unfortunately, was used quite extensively for infants and children. It was sort of a forgetting of how dangerous opium could be at the time because it was seen as just such a useful drug. So it's this article from the Journal of Victorian Culture writes, and I'll quote again, in Charlotte May Young's The Daisy Chain, 1856, we see the decline of an infant due to this process. Flora, the infant's mother, writes to her father describing the child as stating, quote, I never knew a child to sleep as she does. An innocent statement in herself, but unbeknownst to her, the child's nurse had for some time been administering laudanum to the infant. So the infant fails to thrive, basically. It's addicted to opium, and the nurse does this to keep the baby from crying, which perhaps an understandable motivation, but extraordinarily destructive to use laudanum to cure that. Important milestone in not just opium, but history of drug use and recreational drugs and drug culture, if you will, is in Britain in 1822. Thomas de Quincey, a highly educated, highly literate, excellent writer, wrote a book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater, although I believe he was drinking laudanum rather than actually eating opium, as had been done, but they still use the term. So this book sort of had authoritative status for decades and dominated scientific and public views. Like I say, he was very literate, well-educated, was an opium addict himself, and wrote about it clearly. Just to give you one quotation from him, the sense of space and in the end the sense of time were both powerfully affected. Buildings, landscapes were exhibited in proportions so vast as the bodily eye is not fitted to conceive. Space swelled and was amplified to the extent of unutterable infinity. This, however, did not disturb me so much as the vast expansion of time. I sometimes seemed to have lived for 70 or 100 years in one night, nay, sometimes had feelings representative of a millennium passed in that time, or, however, of a duration far beyond the limits of any human experience. So De Quincey's book, it has been sometimes said here in a fairly recent article that it spawned the opioid crisis. Well, I think that's a great exaggeration, but it certainly spawned a lot of use of opium at the time. It went through many editions. We go from the first edition, that's now somewhat valuable, to a 1960s edition on the right with the characteristic typography of the period. There are debates, though, about whether his confession was pro-opium, anti-opium, or both. Well, it really was both. It begins with the pleasures of opium, discussing the early and positive phase of his experience, and then it moves on to the much longer pains of opium, recounting the author's problems with actually taking opium, like insomnia, nightmares, frightening visions, and difficult physical symptoms, essentially addiction and the problems of addiction. De Quincey wasn't the only well-known writer in England in the 19th century who was an opium addict. A number of the English Romantic poets who were cultural rock stars of the time, we might almost say, well, particularly Bryan, who I've talked about with tobacco, cigars in particular. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge, very well known. His best known poem is probably Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but he was a famous and important poet. He had been in poor health since childhood, had anxiety and depression, perhaps even bipolar disorder. He started taking laudanum for rheumatic fever and became a lifelong addict. Probably his second most famous poem is Kubla Khan, and it was inspired by an opium dream, because, as I said before, opium is characterized after a certain period of relaxation of a sleep with very, very vivid dreams. And the first line is very well known. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran. And to quote here from this book, according to Coleridge's preface, the poem was composed in one night after he experienced an opium-influenced dream, after reading a work on Chengdu, the summer capital of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty of China. What's interesting, well, many interesting things here, but one is that the term Xanadu sort of lives on in the American cultural imagination. So according to the American Film Institute, the greatest American movie of all time is Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles, 1941. It's basically it's about a megalomaniac who builds a great castle that he calls Xanadu. And that movie and the castle was inspired by the newspaper magnate, William Randolph Hearst. We'll meet him again when we talk about cannabis, because he was a great opponent of cannabis, thought it was destroying the country, anti-marijuana crusade. But anyway, his San Simeon Castle was the inspiration. He was the inspiration for the film, and San Simeon was an inspiration for the term Xanadu. And today, some writers talk about Xanadu 2.0, which would be Bill Gates' 66,000 square foot house near Seattle. So that term has entered the cultural imagination of the U.S. Another very important poet connected with opium and hashish, or cannabis, was Charles Baudelaire, French poet of the mid-1800s. He wrote a very famous, well-known book, translated into English as Artificial Paradises, Opium and Hashish or cannabis. He took a sort of a romantic, subversive view of drugs, that they could potentially be a creative muse, inspire literary production. But he also included a somewhat longer medical discourse stigmatizing opium and hashish as destructive and addictive. Many people, because of this, different writers can extract different messages from Artificial Paradises. Some would say that Baudelaire really promoted the idea of an artistic elite who merit special drug dispensation due to their inherent genius. Like I say, that's one possible interpretation. Another is that this book is really a warning against these drugs, that the paradise they offer turns out to be artificial and not something to be commended. Meanwhile, back to going into Asia, important developments were occurring, in particular the development of what is usually called opium smoking, although to be precise, it's vaping, because opium won't really burn and smoke. But it can be vaporized, and the alkaloids can go into the lungs and be absorbed much more rapidly than eating. And as we've seen with other drugs, when you can absorb those chemicals rapidly through snorting, injecting, smoking, vaping, whatever, it's generally going to have a much more intense euphoric experience than it would in the slow eating and drinking process. So anyway, once it can be vaped, you get faster, more euphoric effects. That makes it more addictive. It spreads to new areas and becomes widely traded. There's a twofold process in making opium vapable. The first was simply breaking into little pieces and combining it with tobacco in a cigar, resulting in what was, or a pipe, I suppose, too, resulting in what was called madak, which the tobacco will burn. That will bring the opium pieces to a high enough temperature that they'll start to vaporize. Not very effectively. So I have here the marriage of opium and tobacco to create this. Nobody knows who created it or when, probably sailors, but there's nothing written on it. We do know that this substance, madak, this opium and tobacco, was used widely by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia. So the Dutch East India Company was this extraordinarily powerful and profitable corporation, especially in the 17th century, but through the 18th as well, and ended up controlling the main trade networks of what is now Indonesia, but also had extensive trade with Japan, China, India, Persia, and other countries. But to quote Engelbert Kempfer, was associated with the VOC, wrote a very important book on Japan. But to quote from him, no commodity throughout the Indies, and by the Indies here we mean Indonesia, is retailed with greater profit by the Batavians, in other words, the VOC, their headquarters was Batavia, now Jakarta. Anyway, then opium, with its users cannot do without, nor can they come by it, except it be brought by ships of the Batavians from Bengal and the Coromandel coast of southeast India. It's very interesting. The VOC and the Dutch government, after they took over from the VOC in the 1800s, declined to grow opium in Indonesia, in their Indonesian holdings. If you remember, they grew coffee and then later tea avidly, and they grew tobacco. And they actually used the addictiveness of tobacco, like they did the addictiveness of opium, to help them maintain their profits. But they didn't want to grow it there, and the main theory is that they were afraid that if they start growing it, that they would lose control, that people would start growing it on their own, and it was so profitable when they controlled everything, they didn't want that to happen. So they obtained opium from the British East India Company, based in South Asia, in India, bought opium from them, and then sold it in Southeast Asia. A second development occurs somewhat later with a directly smokable or vapable opium with even greater euphoric effects. That's something that's called chandu. It has to be processed more highly. It's boiled, it's strained. It's an even more elaborate process. Nobody knows when or where this was developed. Probably sometime in the 18th century, and maybe in India, maybe in Southeast Asia. Had to be vaporized with a special lamp. There's a whole set of paraphernalia associated with it. And yes, it was also spread by the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. So that's the VOC and EIC. Opium vaping then comes to China. Chinese had known about opium since the Tang Dynasty as a medicinal product. They were importing it. It's this madak mixture with tobacco is introduced in the late 1600s. It starts to spread. It's mostly elites who are using it through well into the 18th century. But a lot of Chinese workers would go to Southeast Asia. Many stay there. Many would return to China. And it's thought that Chinese workers in what is now Indonesia were exposed to this chandu vapable opium and came back to China with opium addiction. But a lot of this isn't really exactly sure. There's, like I said, elaborate Chinese paraphernalia for opium vaping. We have the opium lamp that channels the precise amount of heat to vaporize it, and pipes and other sorts of implements for preparation. And much of this is highly collectible. We talked about collectible snuff boxes and beetle boxes. Well, opium paraphernalia is the same. That's a lamp, opium lamp on the left, and on the right, all sorts of different accoutrements for this. Opium vaping was generally done reclining. It's much easier to control. You got to have that pipe right over the lamp, and you just got to heat it to the right amount. So it's more easily done on the side. It has been suggested that this is where the term hipster comes from. I doubt that. I think it's just a coincidence. But anyway, around the year 1800, the British East India Company really starts to push opium sales in China. I talked about this in the lecture on tea. There was a real problem with booming tea imports from China into the United Kingdom. The Chinese refused to buy British manufactured products. What the Chinese wanted was silver that came out of the Americas, particularly at this time from the Spanish colony of New Spain or Mexico and Peru. Those were the big silver mines were, but the Napoleonic Wars in the very late 1700s, early 1800s really disrupt the flow of silver. There's a big problem of outflow of silver to China. The dominant economic theory at the time was still mercantilism, which claimed that a country should hoard as much precious metal as they could and keep from exporting it. Anyway, this led to, in 1793, the British government to grant the British East India Company a monopoly on producing opium in India, aimed to sell in China to make up for the huge outlays of silver. There was about the same time this famous mission, the Macartney mission of British diplomat to Qing Empire of China to try to encourage the Chinese to purchase British exports. And to quote the emperor, writing back to King George III, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. Therefore, there is no need to import the manufacturers of outside barbarians in exchange for our own products." British obviously were quite upset. And this is really when the export of opium starts to become quite important. China is not happy about it, and they try to crack down on the opium trade. But around the year 1800, they are beset by a very, very powerful rebellion known as the White Lotus Rebellion. You can see it lasts for some 8 years, right around the turn of the century. White Lotus movements had been present for a long time. It was a sort of a messianic movement rooted in Buddhist and in also folk religious beliefs. It sought a return to the Ming dynasty. China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, was actually not ethnically Chinese, but ethnically Manchu from Manchuria. So a lot of people wanted to return to an indigenous dynasty. It resulted in some 16 million deaths. It was incredibly destructive and very difficult for the Chinese state, the Qing Empire, to finally get a hand on it, which they eventually did. But it meant they were not able to really police their trading system with Britain, and opium really takes off. I also have their economic downturn. China had been very, very prosperous through the 18th century, and right around 1800, there's an inflection point, and it starts, poverty increases and the economy declines. Now, opium is one of the reasons for that, but a lot of scholars have suggested that China had grown in population so much in the preceding century that it was reaching ecological limits, and these were resulting in a lot of problems of deforestation, floods, and so on. But at any event, in the early 19th century, Chinese opium imports are surging, and you can see this graph here estimating it. So you can see in 1800s, still pretty small. We're talking about tons here, 200, but then increasing remarkably, some tenfold by 1830s. 1833, the British government ends the East India Company's monopoly. So now private traders, British and from other countries, get in on the action. More opium is brought in. There's more competition. Opium becomes cheaper. and it moves down the socioeconomic ladder down into the middle, and down into a working class culture, no longer an elite habit. We've seen the same thing with a number of other drugs, both dangerous and relatively benign, like coffee and tea. Anyway, the EIC continues to be involved in this, particularly on the production side, and it is enriched greatly. And just to know what the EIC was, it was an empire in its own right, sort of a monopolistic quasi-state. Until 1856, it was not the British government ruling huge sections of India. It was the British East India Company. So to quote the Wikipedia, at its height, the company was the largest corporation in the world, had its own armed force, 3 presidency armies, 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at the time. So it was much more than a company. The last real topic I'm going to move into and for today's lecture is the effects of this on India. So the EIC had this monopoly on opium production in India, although later that changes, as we shall see. But it was the EIC that was really starting this whole process. And the British East India Company and Britain as a whole profited greatly, but there's a lot of evidence that this resulted in a tremendous amount of impoverishment in India. So what the EIC, East India Company, did was force peasants to grow opium. They did pay them minimally. That's better than the VOC with coffee, which they just simply forced peasants to produce through their local, more elite Indonesian intermediaries. But peasants were paid, but it wasn't enough. Rice production declines, and malnutrition and poverty increase in opium growing areas. And they could see this, and the effects linger to this day. So the EIC had its production area in the state of Bihar in northern India. That's in the lower Ganges Valley. It was historically a demographic and economic core of India. Today it is by far India's poorest state. You can see on the map on the right per capita GDP by state, and Bihar is at the bottom. And it's at the bottom of every socioeconomic indicator you can find in India. It's starting to do a bit better these days, but it's noted for its corruption, poverty, it's a dysfunctional government, and the like. And it was precisely in this area that was the opium production zone. It didn't cover the whole state by any means, but it was economically pretty dominant. All the opium processing was done in one factory in one company town, Ghazipur. And that illustration on the left is a rather sanitized view of the factory at the time. We have a photograph later on of these elaborate procedures for making opium. Interestingly, it's still an opium town. It's not in Bihar, but it's in Uttar Pradesh, the second poorest state of India, but right on the border. So opium is still being produced there in an official factory because, of course, it has opium and morphine have legitimate medical uses. Morphine extracted from opium. There is evidently so much opium waste in Ghazipur that even the monkeys are addicted. I mean, I have a hard time believing this, but evidently it's true. An article here called "Junkie Monkeys Become Drug War Casualty," and an illustration here actually is this is, I believe it's a fabric with the monkeys of Ghazipur. I put a red circle so you can actually see the monkey, but it's supposedly we have these opium-addled monkeys having a hard time swinging well, monkeys don't really swing, but in the trees. Now, an interesting thing is that under British rule, and this was both under the EIC and under the British government, about 2/3 of India was ruled directly, first by the company and then by the British government after 1856. But there were a variety of what were called princely states, and these were states that continued to be run in a day-to-day manner by the indigenous rulers. Some were Hindu Maharajas, some were Muslim emirs or sultans. Sikhs had their own state as well. They couldn't do anything the British didn't want them to do. There was always a British resident at court to make sure that they didn't engage in any independent foreign policies, but they basically got to run their own show. And this was true in opium as well. So you have the central Indian region of Malwa that then after 1830s, when the EIC no longer has a monopoly in selling in China, others can sell. It becomes an open market. And in the state of Malwa, indigenously run state, opium becomes cultivated in a large scale manner. But here the export is controlled by Indian businesses, not by the East India Company. So anyway, the EIC is not happy. They try to stop it, but actually the producers are more efficient in Malwa. Interestingly enough, coerced production generally results in inefficient production. In Malwa, it was not coerced. Peasants were growing opium to get in on the market and to make money, and it was being purchased and sold by Indian entrepreneurs. This is actually very beneficial for Bombay. So from Bihar, Bihar would have sent its opium to Calcutta, which was the center of British rule in the east, and then exported to China. Whereas in Malwa, it was sent to Bombay, which was under British rule, but it became a much more entrepreneurial city, a city noted for its not just Europeans, but indigenous entrepreneurs. And Bombay eventually surpasses Calcutta and becomes the economic core of India, now renamed Mumbai. It still has that role. Now the British are still benefiting because they're charging export taxes, which goes into their coffers, but most of the profits are going in this case to indigenous entrepreneurs. And we can even compare the color of the flowers, the white opium of Bihar, the red opium of Malwa. And there were a few families, especially, that really made vast fortunes. The most interesting probably is the Sassoon family, originally from Iraq, Iraqi Jewish family. But they move into Bombay. They become very involved in this. You can see in Shanghai, China, Sassoon House. We have the original sort of leader of the family, David Sassoon, in his traditional dress, and then his sons in varying different kinds of dress. But even though they're of Baghdadi origin and are Jewish, which is generally not going to stand them in well stead in Victorian Britain, but on the other hand, they made enough money. They become known as the Rothschilds of the East. The Rothschilds were a European Jewish family that was so successful that they were accepted by European elites and ennobled, as was the Sassoon family. And it's interesting to trace this family down the line. You may have heard of Siegfried Sassoon. His name sounds German, but he was as English as they could be. Evidently, his mother was a fan of Wagner. But Siegfried Sassoon was one of the most famous English war poets, decorated for bravery on the Western Front in World War I, and one of the leading poets of the era. I should note that Vidal Sassoon is not a member of the family. He comes from, his ancestors came from the same area, Jewish, Middle Eastern Jewish family, but actually he was very poor and became he ends up as a shampoo magnate, I guess you could say, and there's still a Vidal Sassoon company. It wasn't just the Sassoons. Another group of people who profited mightily were the Parsis. Now, the Parsis are people who were of the Zoroastrian faith, the old faith of Iran. When Islam came in, a number of them fled and moved to India, to Bombay in particular. And they became quite successful mercantile community, also very Anglophilic, and they really associated with English culture, playing cricket and so on. But a number of them rose to very high economic levels. And as this article on the Parsis of India and the opium trade notes, Parsi involvement in the trade constituted an important component in the rise of Western capital in Asia, the development of Indian and imperial economies, the growth of Bombay. The Parsis constitute one of the first and arguably most significant examples of the ability of drugs to positively transform the state of one of the world's smallest communities. There are only some 60, 70,000 Zoroastrians today. I guess this is particularly the Parsi community. There's a small Zoroastrian community in Iran, but again, just a few tens of thousands. The Parsis are diminishing. They have a very low birth rate. There's a lot of marriage outside of the Zoroastrian faith. But it's interesting, there's still some very powerful families. Here we have a Wall Street Journal article on 5 billionaire families from India's Parsi minority. And we have here the mystery with a net worth of 15 billion, Poonwala 12 billion. The most famous Tata, and this has the Tata family at only 570 million. That's relatively small. But I think it's because the family is so large and has so many different members that it's hard to keep track. But the Tata business enterprise includes Tata Consultancy, but also Tata Motors, including Jaguar Land Rover and Tetley Tea. You can go back to the lecture on tea if you're interested, and you can hear about Tetley Tea. Singapore profited mightily. Singapore on the trade route in between East Asia and South Asia, located at a very strategic location in the Strait of Malacca, where trade was funneled. It became Britain's Gibraltar of the East, highly fortified, and a real keystone to British imperial policy. But note, as this article mentions, the percentage of revenue derived from opium of the total revenue of the colony from 1898 to 1906 was 43% and 59%. The government earned most of its revenue by franchising the opium trade to wealthy Chinese businessmen. Singapore at the time was noted as a fast-growing, thriving, entrepreneurial port city, but was also famous or infamous for its opium dens, prostitution, rings, and so on, which were eventually cleaned up. Today, Singapore is one of the richest countries of the world, but also one of the most, perhaps the most stringent anti-drug laws. Coming into the Singapore airport, you can see signs like the death penalty in Singapore for drug traffickers. And an article here, Singapore executed another drug offender, why the country clings to the death penalty. And we have here of someone who was hanged for abetting the smuggling of 2.2 pounds of cannabis or marijuana. So just extraordinarily harsh drug laws. Now, those people who are favorably disposed to this say, well, look at Singapore. It's one of the safest places in the world. Actually, teaching on Southeast Asian history a few years back, I had an adult student in the course, someone who's part of Stanford University's Distinguished Career Program, where you can go back and take classes. But he had lived in Singapore for about 20 years, and I was talking about the harshness of these sort of things. And he said, well, there are advantages. I could let my 15, 16-year-old daughters, they could go out anywhere at any time in Singapore, and I knew they'd always be safe. So I guess you can argue both sides of this. And then finally, my last slide is meanwhile in China. Chinese economy is declining. Its politics are becoming more fractious and destabilizing, and opium addiction is spreading massively. I will include this slide again in part 2 of this lecture, when I will go on to talk about the Opium Wars, Britain defeating China so that they can keep selling opium, talk about the transition from opium to morphine and then to heroin, talk about opiate addiction in the late 1800s in the United States, the prohibition of morphine, opium, and heroin in the early 20th century, the revival of the opium and heroin trade, and then the geography of opium growing and opium production, and products derived from opium today. So I hope you can tune into that, and thank you for listening.